The European technology sector is in the midst of a terrifying death spiral, moving further and further behind the giants of the USA and China, and the once great economic force that dominated the industrial age now finds itself struggling to keep up. In this video, I'm going to tell you all about the scale of the problem and why I think it will be difficult, if not impossible, for Europe ever to catch up. Let's start by examining the scale of the challenge. Europe's economic engine is slowing down, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the technology sector. While Europe has traditionally excelled in the legacy technologies like energy and automotive sectors, it's falling woefully behind in the technologies that will define the future, like AI and software. Since 2000, per capita income has grown almost twice as fast in the USA as it has in Europe. The world's top tech companies are dominated by US and Chinese firms, with Europe home to just 4 of the top 50. And here is a staggering fact. No European company with a market cap over 100 billion euros has been founded in the last 50 years. In contrast, the US has created 6 companies worth over 1 trillion over the same time period. The gap is accelerating. The situation is so dire that even the companies that are being founded in Europe end up fleeing to the USA to secure funding. Between 2008 and 2021, almost 30% of unicorns founded in Europe, that's companies that went on to be valued at $1 billion or more, relocated abroad, looking for better environment, fewer regulatory hurdles, and of course, money with which to scale. Now, that's not to say nobody's aware of these issues. Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank, recently created a huge report laying out what he believes are the key fundamental steps that the bloc needs to take. But it's also been raised by founders like Spotify's Daniel Ek and Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, who believe that the EU needs to embrace open source. Take AI as just one example. Europe's leading AI firm, Mistral, was recently valued at around $6 billion. Sounds impressive, right? Well, compare that to OpenAI, the leading AI firm in the US, which is valued at $157 billion. It immediately becomes apparent that there is a gulf in scale, ambition, and funding. So now we've established the scale of the challenge, but how is it that Europe fell so far behind? And what, if anything, can the continent do? It's no secret that innovation thrives on research spending, and here Europe is falling woefully short. In 2022, the European Union spent 352 billion euros on research and development. Now, while that might sound impressive, it's important to put it into context. This only represents about 2.22% of the EU's GDP, a figure that's actually dropped slightly from previous years. Meanwhile, the US and China are way ahead. The US alone spends over 3.4% of its GDP on research and development, which amounted to around $656 billion in 2022. China, while still catching up, has surpassed Europe in key areas like AI and hardware development. But here's the kicker. It's not just about how much money is spent. It's also about where that money gets allocated. In the US, it tends to be far more into high-risk, high-return technologies like AI and biotech, whereas in Europe, investment tends to be skewed towards mid-tech companies in things like automotive and industry, which tend to yield less of a high return because the technology is not as groundbreaking as those that are on the very frontier over in the US. And it's not just a funding problem. European countries are also hamstrung by regulatory complexity. With lots of different countries and regulatory systems, it's difficult for any unified funding ecosystem to emerge. R&D is the lifeblood of technological leadership, and as we've already seen, Europe is bleeding out. And this is especially the case in the most transformative technology of our time, artificial intelligence. AI isn't just another technological trend. It is a technology that is going to revolutionize all of the other technologies. The impact of AI is already being felt across industries from healthcare to finance, and it's predicted to reshape many more. And you don't have to look far to see evidence of this. The most recent Nobel Prize in Chemistry has been awarded not to a chemist, but to an AI founder in Demis Hassabis, the co-founder of DeepMind, which is just a reminder that the future of scientific discovery itself is going to be shaped by artificial intelligence. And here, yet again, Europe finds itself falling behind. Demis himself is the founder that set up his business in the UK and has now relocated to the US because it was bought out by Google. Since 2017, a staggering 70% of the world's foundational AI models have been developed in the USA. The numbers tell a grim story for Europe. Between 2018 and 2023, the US attracted more than 120 billion euros in private AI investment, while Europe, including the UK, managed just 9 billion in the same period. Take just large language models as an example. 73% of frontier models are being developed in the US, 9% are being developed in China. Meanwhile, Europe struggles to make a mark. You really can't understate how crucial AI development is going to be for the entire technology ecosystem. It's a flywheel technology. Progress in AI begets progress in other industries. With the US and China dominating in talent and funding, Europe risks falling behind into a position where it is unable ever to recover. In the next part, we're going to explore how Europe's regulatory environment is making the situation so much worse. The European Union likes to think of itself as a regulatory giant and a world leader in regulating technologies. But what that actually means in practice is death by 1,000 cuts for all of their technology firms. The whole raft of different laws, including their recent AI Act, just make it difficult for smaller startups to compete because they've got to spend so much time worrying about compliance, they don't have enough time to spend on innovation. There are currently over 100 tech-focused laws and more than 270 regulators active across the EU's digital networks. The introduction of the AI Act in 2023 is just the latest example of this overzealous approach, which makes it incredibly difficult for startups to compete globally. The AI legislation is particularly short-sighted because nobody really knows how this technology is going to develop. It's early days, and regulating for something that has not fully matured risks creating a whole load of redundant regulation which will never be applicable to any of the technologies that come out of the other end. The EU's fragmented regulatory environment is another huge problem. With 27 member states, each with its own labour laws, procurement rules and digital regulations, scaling a business across Europe is like navigating a minefield. In the US, tech companies have a unified market to target, and that's a massive advantage, especially because there's one language. And while this regulation is designed to protect citizens, it is worth asking whether Europe's tight control over data, over AI, and over privacy is actually achieving any of these aims. Because if it restricts the deployment of technologies, as we've seen recently with OpenAI and with Meta, actually it's reducing the quality of goods and service that its citizens have access to. Rather than fostering a world-leading technology ecosystem, what it's actually doing is building a fence to keep the greatest innovators out and driving those who are born in Europe away into friendlier regulatory environments. This combination of fragmented markets, bureaucracy, and heavy-handed lawmaking is not just slowing Europe down, it's putting the whole continent at a structural disadvantage when compared to the rest of the world. Now, Mario Draghi, who is the former head of the European Central Bank and whose report on EU innovation is what much of this video has been based on, has suggested some proposals aimed at tackling some of these structural issues. First on his list is transforming the European Innovation Council into an ARPA-style agency. If you're not familiar with ARPA, it's the American research agency that brought us world-changing innovations like GPS and the internet. Draghi believes a similar agency in Europe could spearhead disruptive innovation. He also emphasizes the need for smoother processes for tech spin-outs and more favorable conditions for SMEs. He wants to cut back on bureaucracy to stop tech firms fleeing to Silicon Valley, which is a laudable aim, but I suspect much easier to say than it is to actually do in practice. Another part of his strategy is Europe's computational capacity. His plan calls for increased investment in infrastructure to lower the cost of compute and make the region more competitive in terms of AI deployment. Finally, he argues that Europe needs to create a much more welcoming environment for venture capital, which of course it does. But again, it's probably always wanted to have a friendly environment for venture capital. Saying that you want a friendly environment for venture capital is not the same as actually creating one. And it remains to be seen whether there is the will across Europe to actually do so. So as you can probably tell, I am skeptical as to whether Draghi's words are actually going to be picked up by leaders across the continent, or whether actually they're going to fall on deaf ears. They're ambitious and necessary, but actually they may not in fact even be enough, because there are other fundamental systemic problems that Europe is still yet to grapple with. The first of these is demographics. Innovation tends to come from younger people. The younger you are, the more creative you will tend to be. Europe's demographics are not very good. The birth rates are below replacement rate of 2.1 across most European countries, and they're only as high as they are because of waves of immigration. Now, while immigrants from around the rest of the world may do a good job at propping up birth rates and doing lots of the low-paid work, across the majority, they do not tend to be highly educated innovators. And those that are super smart, of course, want to be heading to Silicon Valley. Now, China's demographics do admittedly look even worse than Europe's, but China's a much bigger country, and it has a whole heap of state spending to deploy on its most innovative firms. Europe, by contrast, simply doesn't. Europe also has some of the highest energy prices in the world, and in an age of AI where computational power is A, extremely important, but B, extremely energy intensive, that does make a structural disadvantage. The war in Ukraine has meant that big leading European countries like Germany have stopped importing fossil fuels. They decommissioned all of their nuclear power plants years ago, and so they have some of the highest energy prices on the continent. Germany is not the country that you want to be lagging behind if you're trying to build up your technology sector. Germany should be the thriving hub of European technology because it's got an incredibly impressive history across those sectors that Europe does tend to excel in, like automotive and like industry. This should be the place where the AI revolution really kicks off for Europe, but Germany is stagnating because it can't afford to power its own economy. If you contrast this to places like the USA, where people like Sam Altman are talking about building their own nuclear power plants to fuel the vast data centers that are required to build the most exciting frontier AI models, there is really just no comparison. And then finally, there's the flywheel effect of AI that I mentioned earlier. AI progress feeds on itself. The more data you have, the better data you have, the better models you're able to create in the future. The better your models, the more efficient the businesses and governments that run on them. And as we begin to see AI deployed across our societies more broadly, you're going to start to see efficiency gains across every single different area of the economy. If the fundamental technologies that are making this happen are being bought in from other continents, that is not going to allow the European tech ecosystem to grow in its own nations. Much like the internet revolution, it's more likely that American companies will come in, like Google did with search and like Meta did with social media, and just flood the market before any European tech companies can get off the ground. So even with Draghi's reforms, Europe will still be fighting against unfavorable demographics, sky-high energy prices, and an exponential growth in capability that's happening in both China and the USA. So while these ambitions are noble and necessary, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it may already be too late. The European tech doom spiral is already in full effect, and it's going to have to take something spectacular to reverse that trend. The EU risks being left behind for good. Now, if you're still watching, I just want to take a minute at the end of this video to say thank you for sticking with me for this long. I hope you enjoyed the vid, and I would love to hear what you think in the comments. Finally, if you are one of the very many people who has watched several of my videos and has not yet smashed that subscribe button, then I really hope you will consider doing so. That's it from me. I'll see you next time.